friends, to another reading of the Hobbit for Chapter 9. Let's see where our friend's journey has led us. Barrels out of bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 of the 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the path lay, but they never found out if they were right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into the blackness of night, when suddenly there sprang the light of many touches all around them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leaped wood elves with their bows and spears, and called the dwarves to halt. There was no thought of a fight, even if the dwarves had not yet been in such state. They were actually glad to be captured. Their small knives, only weapons they had, would have been no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long time, one behind the other, and counted them, they were never founded or counted the Hobbit, nor did they hear or feel him trotting along with behind their torchlight. They had left their prisoners into the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded, but that did not make much difference, for even Bilbo, with use of his eyes, could not see what they were going, and neither nor the other knew where they had started from anyway. Bilbo had all he could do to keep up with the torches, but the elves were making the dwarves go as fast as ever they could. Sick and weary as they were, the king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly, the torches stopped, and the Hobbit had just time to catch up before they could begin to cross the bridge. This was the bridge that led across the river to the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There the great beaches came right down to the bank till their feet were in the stream. Across the bridge, the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over at the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang. Inside, the passages were lit with a red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, and echoing paths. They were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with clean air. In a great hall with pillars hewn of the living stones sat the elf king on a chair with a carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers, and in his hand he held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here. There's no escape from my magic doors for those who were once behind them. Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings and where they were going and where they were coming from, but he got a little more news out of them than Thorin. They were surly and angry and did not even pretend to be polite. "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry?" Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest, and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I've right now to make what brings you here. If you will not tell me now, I will keep you in all prison until you've learned sense and manners." Mr. Baggins. It was a very long time that he lived in that place all alone, and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remotest corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elf King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the wood elves, sometimes with the king at their head, would from time to time ride out to hunt or to other business in the woods and the lands to the east. Then, if Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out just behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once, he was nearly caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed, yet did not dare march them behind of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in the torchlight, or fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, he was not very often. He didn't know good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and he did not know where the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself, until a chance came of returning. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from store or table when no one was at hand. I am like a burglar that can't get away, but most go on miserably burglaring the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and dullest part of all the wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by my own warm fireside with the lamp shining. He often wished, too, that he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that, of course, was quite impossible, and he soon realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Eventually, a week or two in the sneaking sort of life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 selves in different parts of the palace, and after a time, he got to know his way about very well. What was his own surprise one day to overhear some of the guards talking to learn that there was another dwarf in prison too, and a especially deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that it was Thorin. And after a while, he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chief of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was beginning to think of telling the king all about the treasure and his quest. Then suddenly he heard Bilbo's little voice at his keyhole. He could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he came to the door and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each other of the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them all about that Thorin was chief, was also in prison close at the hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, nor before Thorin gave the word, for Thorin had taken heart again, hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share of the treasure, until all hope of escaping another way had disappeared, until in fact the years passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels for the king elves, and especially their king, where they fawned wine, though no vines grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought from far away, from their kinsfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in the distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered to the trapdoors and their use, and lurking there, listening to the talk of the king's servants, he learned that the wine and other goods came up the rivers or over the land to the long lake. It seemed a town of men still throve there, built out on the bridges far into the water as a protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up to the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and pulled or rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded onto flat boats. Where the barrels were empty, the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened the water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbing along until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river, where the bank jutted out near to the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town, which stood close to the point where the forest river flowed into the long lake. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate. He wondered if it could be used for the escape of his friends, and at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passengers, taking the torchlight with them and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chef of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be at hard work tonight, clearing the cellars of the empty wood, so let us have a drink first to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste with you and see if it is fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do send up poor stuff." When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance all once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down on a table with two large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a good elf drowsy. But this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorwinion, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feasts only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head, then laid it on the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice, but soon his head too nodded on the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then it crept the Hobbit, for soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passengers toward the cells. The great bunch seemed very heavy to his arms, and his heart often mouthed in spite of the ring. He could not prevent the keys from making every now and loud the clink and clack, which put himself in a tremble. First he unlocked Balin's door and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarves were inside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad he was out. Where is some little stone room? He wanted to stop and ask questions and know what Bilbo was going to do, all about it. Very soon, the chief guard nodded his head. Wait, is this recording? Yeah, okay. Very soon, the chief guard nodded his head, and then he laid on the table, fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice, but soon his head too nodded to the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passages towards the cells. The great bunch seemed very happy to his arms, but his heart was often in his mouth, in spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a loud clink and clack, which put him in a fearsome little stone first. He wanted to stop and ask questions, and no, Bilbo was not going to do all about that. No, not now, said the hobbit. Just follow me. We must keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape, or none. This is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next. We'll chains on your hands and feet, and I expect don't argue. That's a good fellow. Then off he went from door to door until following had grown to 12. None of them any too nimble with the dark, and what their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time they bumped into each other, for grunted or whispered in the dark. Drat this dwarfish racket, he said to himself. But all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merry-making. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon, far down in the deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. Upon my word, said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends. Gandalf spoke true as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the time comes. I'm sure we all forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next? Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain this idea as far as he could, and he could not feel at all sure how the dwarves would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. We shall be bruised and battered to pieces and drowned too, for certain, they muttered. We thought you had got some sensible notion when you managed to get a hold of the keys. This is a mad idea. Very well, said Bilbo, very downcast and also rather annoyed. Came along back to your nice cells, and I will lock you in all again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I shall ever get a hold of these keys again, even if I feel inclined to try. That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to just do what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way into the upper halls, or to fight their way out of the gates that closed by magic, and it was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So, following the hobbit down into the lowest cellars they crept. They passed a door through which the chief guard and the butler could be seen, and still happily snoring and smiles upon their faces. The wine was Darwinian, brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard next day, even though Bilbo, before they went on, stole and kind-heartedly put the keys back in his belt. That will save him some trouble, is he in this far, said Mr. Baggins to himself. He wasn't a bad fellow, and quite a decent to the prisoners. It will puzzle them all, too. They will all think very strong magic to pass through all these locked doors and disappear. Disappear. We've got to get busy very quick if this is to happen. Balin was told off to watch the guards and the butler, and give warning if they stirred. The rest went into adjoining cellar with the trapdoors. There was little time to lose. Before long, as Bilbo knew, some elves were under orders to come down and help the butler get the empty barrels through the doors into the stream. These were in fact already standing in rows in the middle of the floor, waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these were not much use, as they could not easily be opened at the end without a deal of noise, nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others, which had been used for bringing other stuffs like butter, apples, and all sorts of things to the king's palace. They soon found 13, with room enough for the dwarfs each. In fact, some were so roomy that they were climbed, and the dwarfs thought anxiously of the shaking and the bumping they would get inside, though Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to stack them into closely as could be managed in a short time. At 12 those were stowed. Thorin had given a lot of trouble, and turned and twisted in his tub and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel, while Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about his arrow holes, and said he was stifling even before his lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could to close holes in the sides of the barrels, and he could fix all the lids as safely as he could. And now he was left alone again, running around putting in the finishing touches to the packaging, and hoping against hope that this would song. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls and were bent on returning as soon as they could. "Where's old Gallon?" "The butter," said one. "I haven't seen him at the tables tonight. He ought to be here now to show us what is to be done." "I shall be angry if the old slough coach is late," said another. "I had no wish to waste time down here while the song is up." Came a cry. "Here's the old villain with his head on a jug. He's been having a little feast all to himself and his friend the captain." "Shake him, wake him," shouted the others impatiently. Gallon was not at all pleased at being shaken or wakened, and still less at laughed at. "You're all late," he grumbled. "Here I am, waiting and waiting down here, while you fellows drink and make merry, and forget your tasks. Small wonder if I fall asleep from weariness." "Small wonder," said they, "when the explanation stands closed door in the hand and a jug. Come give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we all fall to. No need to wake the turnkey yonder. He has his share, by the looks of it." Alright, everyone. We will continue this chapter for the next reading to see what Bilbo discovers